that speech on the future of education, shifting our focus to our next panel, Learning in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. We have with us Professor K.K. Agarwal, who is the president of South Asian University, Professor Omar Besbis, who is the director, AI and Business Initiative, Columbia Business School. We also have Professor Han Song Lee, who's from the School of International Service, American University. And this panel is going to be moderated by Mr. Bradley Jardine. He's the managing director of Oxis Society. So a round of applause. Let's welcome all our guests. Need to remind all my panelists that there's a countdown clock, and we like to respect the time.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our session on learning in the age of artificial intelligence. AI is transforming how we work, govern, and conduct business, and even some of our personal lives. Perhaps most profound will occur in how we learn and how we prepare our societies for the technological opportunities and for the challenges ahead. For countries like India, where demographic scale meets technological ambition, this question becomes particularly urgent. How do educational systems, universities, and businesses adapt when knowledge itself is being reshaped by machines? AI is not simply another tool. It challenges assumptions about expertise, creativity, and even the role of universities themselves. We're fortunate to have an exceptional panel representing perspectives from global academic, business, and international policy communities. And I'm looking forward to a wide-ranging discussion how institutions and individuals should adapt for the future. I'll begin the conversation with a very broad question. I'll let our panel members jump in, and then we'll have an engaging discussion. First, I just want to ask, how do you think AI will change the way that people learn and develop their expertise for the next decade? And will universities continue to remain the central institution for educational development? I guess I can ask if you take a first answer.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having us. It's a great honor to be on the education panel, not least because I also brought 3 students from the US here. So I hope they're listening. And in my view, this is no longer a time when we think about the whether question. This is a question of when's, how, and whither, from which source of knowledge, and especially ethical knowledge, do we derive the information that goes into the training of these models, and how do we use them to empower our students and not to actually crowd out their creative thinking, and what kind of vision for human flourishing that we're tending towards. So it is inevitable that we are in this AI moment. For me, it's very hard to tell students not to use it, so I've given up on that. But it's not only because of the volumetric size of the AI education economy, which is probably going to grow from 10 to 30 billion in the future in the next 5 years or so, but because we grow up, the students will be growing up and forming their worldviews when the entire generation from China to Europe to the US and Latin America and to Africa will also be growing up and forming their worldviews accompanied by AI. So in a world where you're embedded into interacting with others who use AI, it's very hard to ignore it and just say, I'm going to refrain from it. So yeah, my view is both one of caution and of optimism. I think we can go into more details next.
Yeah. Do you remain cautious or optimistic?
Thank you. Yeah. First of all, maybe it's useful to say, I mean, all industries are being right now disrupted by AI, and education is no exception there. There are definitely big changes coming across in education, and the way one can think about it in education is, what should we do about AI? What should we teach about AI? But also, how can we leverage AI to teach differently, to think differently about pedagogy, to think differently about assessments of students, right? And in some sense, on both sides, in some sense, there are of course risks. When you think about AI through the old way through which education was delivered, indeed there are a lot of risks. But when you look at it the other way, there are huge opportunities that AI brings forward. It brings forward the possibility of personalized learning at scale. It brings forward the possibility of democratizing access to knowledge, which wasn't possible before. So in a way, I'm partly optimistic because of all of these new possibilities, but these can only be harnessed if we actually change the way we do things, right? If we remove this inertia that exists in educational institutions and break that inertia by innovating at a much faster pace than we have done historically.
Just some final remarks.
Hello.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm Professor K.K. Agarwal. I am President of South Asian University. So in that sense, I have some idea about the education of the South Asian countries, including Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, etc. When we talk about AI in education, I think this question, whether AI in education or not, is a broad question. AI is there in education. The best thing is to make sure that how can we leverage AI, particularly for this region, India and the surrounding countries, in a much better way, where the resources are limited. I think one very great opportunity for us all in education is that AI can be very helpful in designing the education curriculum for each student in some sense, on a customized basis. What we say, education cannot be a massified system. Really speaking, education has to be different for each student. We could not do that for the game of numbers, but AI can greatly help us to design what we call as BYOD, build your own degrees, in a much better manner. And that is one unique opportunity which we must take cash on.
Thank you for those thoughts. It's definitely exciting that we can have such personalized education curricula for students. But one of the big questions that people have is, of course, when it comes to knowledge production and dissemination, will AI merely entrench some of these hierarchies of knowledge? And if not, how do we make sure that it widens opportunities for people to gain access to education rather than simply narrowing and entrenching those hierarchical divides that we have today? Can I ask it to you first?
Exactly. I think there are two ways in which AI could entrench those existing fault lines. One is the socioeconomic fault line. There is already research showing that those who go into using AI prepared to tame AI for its own purpose will get more from it, right, than those who go into AI and feel lost because they don't have the prior knowledge to guide AI in a way that is most productive for its own purpose. So there is the socioeconomic challenge there because those who have resources to begin with are more likely to be able to use AI more productively. And there's also an international fault line of resource distributions or maldistribution. As we know, the main large language models, the most popular interfaces are developed not concentrated in one nation, but at least in several nations that are leading powers in AI. So whose values, whose ideas, whose worldviews go into the training of the AI is another matter. So faced with the socioeconomic challenge of inequality and faced with the international challenge of inequality, the question is, how do you develop AI in a more democratized way and diffuse it and decentralize it in a way that allows for experiments across conditions and contexts at the same time so that there is more agency to the students and to their families and their communities to compare and compete. So I think it comes down to a question of whether we can have a competitive and contested a world of AI with alternatives, or are we stuck with a few major providers whose ideas will then subtly or increasingly visibly take over the space for free thinking? Thank you.
What kind of policy options could we make to democratize that access to knowledge through AI?
So, I think already there are many available solutions out there at different price points, right? So there's already, like the open source movement has been very powerful to provide access, actually. And in some sense, certain countries have, during that direction, which has been, I think good in terms of democratizing access. Now, I think there's a question of also, the risk coming back of democratizing too much access. How do you train students to think critically when you have access to something that have a correct answer 99.5% of the time? That's very difficult. But in some sense, that's where, we shouldn't think about education just as a way to, get skills. They are the skills, but it's also personal development, right? And I think that part will continue to be there in the long run. The other part that I want to highlight is that, education has always been about developing critical thinking. That's not going away either. If anything, that's going to be the most important skill going forward, given the access to LLMs and all kinds of tools that are available. So I'm fairly, again, positive about these future developments. I don't know the infrastructure is already to be able to leverage this democratization. There's particular policies at this stage.
Yeah, still too early stage. And to yourself, if you could respond to this as well on the question of hierarchy and creating greater access to education using AI.
Yeah. When you talk about education in the world of AI, which is there today, I think we should be definitely looking at the positive sides. And one of the strong attributes which I feel AI, which is teaching to all youngsters, is when we say prompt engineering, asking questions. Now, so far our students were used to be perfect in answering. Now I think they have to be more perfect in questioning. So there's a very paradigm shift which is coming in education because of AI. And if we emphasize that, that will be better in life in other aspects also. That is art of asking proper right questions, which has become much more important because of artificial intelligence. And secondly, I would like to say artificial intelligence should always be seen as augmented intelligence. I mean, it's not a substitution of human intelligence. Intelligence will have to be with the people to a great extent, but this is a great tool for augmenting our efforts, should be taken note of. And in that perspective, I see a very high, great role of AI being played in the near future.
Thank you for that. And you've mentioned in your classrooms a lot of students are already using AI, and often professors have this struggle between encouraging its use and relying on traditional writing and skills. A lot of people are wondering now, especially starting early in their career, what kind of skills you would be encouraging for an AI future? What kind of skills are going to become increasingly important? And what would you encourage, one, students to focus on as intellectual habits, let's say, to improve their prospects in the future we have ahead of us? And is there anything in the current university structure that you think is now increasingly outdated and that may actually be out of step with AI?
Yes, this is a great challenge for the faculties, right? We have three choices: ban AI in the syllabus and knowing that your students are going to ignore that clause, or say that I'm going to find out if you used AI, which is, sometimes the case, sometimes not the case. Or tell the students that there is a certain way to engage with the AI to empower at least a certain stage of your research, not only in the information gathering, the bibliography generating, and the proofreading, but also in asking the questions that set the agenda. It's okay to do that, but ultimately the idea has to be yours, and you need to defend it in the world. So there is always going to be a stage on which you cannot take out your model and ask how to defend your idea, right, in front of other people who come out of very different ethical and epistemic assumptions. So I would encourage the faculties to form a task force. We have a task force at American University. I know there is a similar structure at Harvard University where I also taught. where faculties come together and share their students' ideas and struggles. So that's on the teaching side, but the students can also get together, right? Have an interactive, interpersonal discussion of how they each approach AI. But in the future, I do believe that a more critical engagement with AI, asking AI challenging questions, and allow yourself to be challenged by AI, comparing across models. There's research showing that asking the same question to an American, a Russian, Chinese, AI gives you very different answers. Well, you can compare notes and then think about your own worldview. How do you take from that instead of being entirely swallowed by this ready supply of answers? So I think the answer is vague, but it's going to be as decentralized as AI itself.
It's a great response. And I wonder if you could share some thoughts on that topic.
Absolutely. So in a way, I think it's a losing battle to try to ban AI, and it's also not serving the students. The students have to be prepared to know how to use AI. But what's changing is, I think, what we can ask from students. Today, students will not just be hired based on credentials, but also based on what they can build. An interview in the past would elicit what students know. Now we can see what can they build. In 2 hours' time, we can test very different skills than we were able to test a few years ago. So that has changed dramatically. And I think the types of profiles and the types of CVs will change dramatically for students. Now, going back to the art of asking the right questions, which is very important, I think, there's also a question of how to change the way we assess students. It's not just about the right or the wrong answers, but now we can assess them based on the depth of the conversations that they go through, right, which can be very different. And I have a colleague who started to assess things in this way. And in general, my view is that you have to allow students to use AI, but they have to be able to stand by themselves without the help of AI. So in some sense, maybe we'll be in a world where we'll slowly go back to oral examinations like in the old days, but the question is how to make these scalable at the scale of a whole university, and maybe AI can be a solution to help in that regard as well.
Same question, please.
I would just like to add that when we talk about AI in education, I think the component which has not been dealt with that strongly is AI for assessment during this period. When we go in for AI for education, our assessment methods will have to go through a complete transformation. The traditional methods of evaluation and assessment will no longer be valid. Many universities, in several good universities, have already shifted to oral examinations rather than written examinations, or the case-based examinations rather than written examinations, because the whole philosophy is not to decry OpenAI, but to make sure that OpenAI prepares our students for more critical thinking, more resource optimization, and finally they are able to use their thinking to supplement these tools. So if we do that, then only we really get the best of it.
Thank you for that. I think another question I've been thinking about a lot myself is, with AI, how will it change the role of educators themselves? Of course, expertise seems to be more easily challenged or undermined as people use AI. AI is now engaging in research itself. The knowledge production process, whether it's journals that are receiving record numbers of AI-generated entries, even peer review process of papers is now being impacted by AI. I wonder how you approach that and teaching, and how do you maintain your role as an educator and with this challenge, and do you utilize AI to increase your publications?
Yes, absolutely. On the note of being able to sometimes say no to AI and ask AI to rethink, it's really up to us, the educators and the students working together, to get to a point where AI is a partner and not some a new technology that is going to crowd out what we already have in the pedagogical experience. But I'm going to mention one positive anecdote and one, I think, an anecdote that gives us cause for reflection. we have the Honorable MP from New Zealand here, and I'll just mention that in my course taught at the American University in the School of International Service, I asked students to compare the English and the Maori version of the Treaty of Waitangi to pick out how concepts such as sovereignty are translated and how meanings are lost in translation, and how we can learn from that rich intercultural encounter in the past. The students are able to do that with AI because I'm not going to be able to provide a special course on Maori so that students can do the international intercultural thinking afterwards. But now they're able to use AI for that purpose. But there was another moment when I asked AI to repeat a section of the Rig Veda. Here we're in India. That's actually a language in which I am versed compared to Maori, in which I'm not. I asked it to repeat 50 times. So ChatGPT refuses to do that because it says this is not conducive to creative and democratic learning by American standards of, you always have to ask Socratic questions and not to repeat. There is an AI bias against repetition that it considers to be a kind of, East and South Asian mode of learning. I told AI, no, sometimes we do repeat because it is a sacred verse or because it's something that by repeating we can gain new understandings from, but ChatGPT continues to refuse to do that, but a few other models do, right? So I think it is an interesting fact that AI has its own built-in assumption of what is good learning. And sometimes it is great. It cautions us against bad learning, but sometimes we also have to overpower AI and tell it that we have a different philosophy of pedagogy, and it's okay to work together on that. Okay, thank you.
I wonder if you could take some quick thoughts on that topic.
The very short answer is that you have to constantly experiment because the technology is changing so fast that we have to constantly understand the limits, but also the possibilities. But definitely it is disrupting, as you said, not just the teaching aspect of universities, but also the research aspect. It's potentially providing, new research assistance for all faculties in some sense. And this is a huge, boost in terms of, productivity, but also ability to pursue different paths. What worries me a little bit sometimes is how will the future generation of instructors be trained and develop this critical thinking over time? That's the big thing that is, very tricky, especially in the context of research, where the knowledge has to be extremely specialized. How will people be able to recognize when these models are wrong or not? And this is something that we have to continuously experiment to explore what are the limits.
Well, thank you very much for those insights. If there's one big takeaway, it's of course that AI is really going to fundamentally change the way that we produce knowledge and consume knowledge. And our panelists have shared very broad perspectives across all of these topics. Very excited to have had this conversation. And of course, we need to find ways as policymakers, businessmen, entrepreneurs, to find ways to expand access to education as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you all very much for being with us on that panel. All right, and now we move forward to an NXT signature session. Yes, the much-awaited Prime Minister's Roundtable. And for this, to discuss Vision NXT, technology, governance, and our future affairs, I invite on stage Honorable Fredrik Reinfeldt, 32nd Prime Minister of Sweden.